The fog rose with the tide. It crept low over the fens and hummocks, pooling in the reeds and sloughs like breath caught and held. The neck had many such mornings, the marsh whispering to itself and the frogs beginning their gossip before light truly woke. But this mist moved with will. It curled around Howland Reed's ankles as he stood knee-deep in a brown channel, feeling for the next patch of firm peat with his frog spear, and it came uphill against the faint flow, muffling bird and breeze alike. Even the dragonflies drifted slow, their glassy wings burdened by dew. Howland stilled, the spear's ash haft steady in his hand. The mist smelt of wet soil and cold stone and a sweetness he had not known since he was a boy. "Father?" A voice called from behind him, light as a reed flute, and it went through him like arrow and answer both. He turned, but the fog heaved, and all he saw was his own pole-boat with its tar-stained planks and a red-eyed heron atop the prow. No Mira was there, no Jojen, nor any of the silent cousins who poled his shallops from one green sluggish place to another in war and peace. Only the heron and the mist that shifted, showing and hiding the rat-latticed roots of black alders, as if some larger lung was breathing just below. Howland set the butt of his spear on a hummock and took 2 careful steps. The marsh took strangers, but it took those who belonged more often when their minds were elsewhere. The heron watched him with a patience older than kings. When he reached his boat, the fog parted as surely as if a blade had cut it. Something small stood upon the planks as if the boat had pulled itself beneath her. She was no taller than a child of 8 summers. Her skin was the brown of walnut heartwood, dappled with paler flecks like leaf shadows in sunlight. Her hair was a black tangle that seemed more root than strand, though little leaves, pale and deft, had caught there, and among them a feather or 2 of crow and snipe. Her eyes were large and gold and slit like a cat's, and there was no fear in them. She set one foot very carefully, as if the planks themselves were some animal's back that might shift under her, and laid her palm, small with long fingers, on the ash shaft of the frog spear. "Howland," she said, and it was his name and the marsh's name and the name of the first pool where he had gone under and seen the sky for the first time in a second sky. "Cranagman, Reed." He swallowed. His voice, when it came, was as low and rough as the bullfrog singing someplace out in the white. "Have we met before, singer?" "All men meet us," she said, and the words were wrong in his ears and right in his bones. "Those who listen. Once, many times, then not again for a long while, and the world forgets we are in it. The forgetfulness is loud now." She tilted her head, as if listening to the fog itself. "The loudness must be quieted. The neck keeps its silence," Howland said. He drew himself up in the boat, trying to think whether any man besides a reed would notice how his hand trembled. "The sons of the bog must shout if they wish to be heard by Southron lords. If it is noise you need, singer, you have come to the wrong place." She smiled, and there were too many teeth. He had a sudden memory of whitecaps on the bight and ships in a storm, and the feel of a tower's shadow at his back. "Noise is for crows and iron. We will make a song. You will make a path." He wanted to say no. He wanted to ask if Jojen had reached the cold cave safely, and if Mira's hands were still warm and sure on a bough, and if all the whispers of green men at the Isle of Faces were more than boys' tales. It would have been easier to pretend the past year an ordinary season of wet and reeds and eels. But he had stood once beneath a tower of white stone and heard the wind blow through dead men's hair, and truth was a thing that stood even when iron broke. He set his spear in the notch of the prow, took up the pole with both hands, and said only, "What path?" She touched the water with one finger. The brown surface shivered, and through fog and reflection he thought he saw, for an instant, the moving bones of the world. Roots twining like veins, stones packed like knuckles. A long pale fish gnawing silt as slow as a winter. "To the eye," she said, "where the faces are. We will call and the men will come, or they will not come, and we will know them." "The god's eye," he said. "Harenhal's shadow lies long there yet. The trident runs iron. The riverlands are cut with new wounds and old. Men will come with swords. They will come with what they are," she said. "You will bring them as you are. Howland Reed." She looked at him for a little, and when the silence fell it was not empty. The pact must be sung again. The truce must be made new, or no truce will matter. He thought of a weeping sap-bleeding face carved long ago and of men kneeling beneath it to swear what they could not keep. He thought of sap that ran no longer and leaves that did not whisper and a winter that would not break. The neck will stand with the old gods, he said. We will go. The fog breathed in and out. When it drew in again she was gone, and the heron lifted, a slant of slate and blood and spearpoint beak, and vanished into the white. Howland pulled the shallop out into the channel. Water lapped wood. The marsh closed behind him with its mutter, as it had closed for his father and his father's father, and he felt as if he had stepped from one skin into another. He raised his voice, not much, and called for his cousins. The fog carried his word into 100 hidden places. By evening, poles knocked dull against planks and frogs went quiet, and a score of boats slid soundless through brown water toward the great rivers and the lake that was an eye. The gods I had long remembered. In the days when men still told each other truths and not only things that would stand and be counted, the lake had been called Ing. The little hamlets on its pebbled shores had sprung up and died like mushrooms after rain, and always the island had remained, and the green men upon it, or the tales of them. There were fires sometimes in Harrenhal's black towers, ghosts of heat rising in yellow fingers when no hands kindled them. There were fishermen who did not return, and there were men who returned speaking a language no wife knew. There were stories of knights who went ashore with swords unsheathed and woke in their mail with moss in their mouths and the taste of sap on their tongues and no memory of having knelt to trees. There were stories, too, of the faces that wept when summer died, and of a winter in which men's tears froze upon their beards and fell and rang against stone. The lake remembered all of it and told nothing except to those who listened. Howland's shallop nosed among the reeds and guttered up against pebbles, and he stepped into water that made his ankles ache. Harrenhal loomed across the water like a ruin of night, its melted towers like candles left too near a fire, war's fingers pressed deep and permanent in black stone. He rested the frog's spear against the boat and listened. Frog sang. A kingfisher laughed, bright as a jewel. Under those small sounds the water spoke around the island in a tongue like the slow turning of a millstone. We are here, it said. We are grinding. We will grind until stones are meal and meal is bread and the bread is eaten. You talk to everything, father? Mira had laughed at him once, years and miles away. And everything talks back, if you listen long enough. How else would a man keep friends? He had said, and she had kissed his cheek and stolen his knife. There were other boats along the shore, hulls from the Green Heart and the gravelly red banks upriver, and a skinny craft made from ribs and skin that could only have come from the first river. The river lords had sent someone. Then, there was a small banner staked in gravel above the tide line, a flutter of black and red that made Howland's shoulders stiffen. He climbed to the shore, the damp lake pebbles firm under his feet, and straightened as a man in a rough green cloak came down the path between the willows. He wore antlers. The tips were pale with sap and time, the bases dark where the wood was worked into a circlet that held them fast around the man's brow. Beneath the antlers the man's hair was the green of old copper, and his beard was braided with willow fronds. His tunic was some undyed cloth, and bare feet showed black with rich earth, as if he had been walking in the gardens of the world. Howland read, he said, and his voice was human and not human, like a septon's chant sung under leaves. The isle greets a Cranigman, and a green man greets Howland, Howland said, because old words had a weight of their own. He glanced past the antlered helm at the path. The island's interior was a pale columned forest, trunks white and smooth and carved, leaves a shiver of red and brown. Weirwoods, so many he had never seen. Faces upon faces, 1,000 gazes, old and fresh both, some tears dried to pink, some wet still on bark. The hairs on his arms rose. I was told to come. We called, the green man said simply. The song carries where it must. Have many answered? Enough and not enough. The blackwood has come. The bracken has come because the blackwood has. The fry has sent a pig with a seal on its ear. There is a septon who carries a book in both hands as if it were a child and does not look up at the trees when he prays. There is a man in a gray robe who smells of old smoke and sharper things who says he comes from Old Town. The green man's mouth quirked. And from the north, read brother, aside from you, no great names that men would write. Names are iron. We have other ways. Howland nodded. The wind off the lake shifted, and he tasted winter, the true kind, the kind that did not need crows to be declared. And the singers? They will sing when men have stopped interrupting, the green man said, and with a small motion of his head the antlers turned into two branches of a living tree. Come. They walked up the path. The air smelled of sap and cold and of a sweetness that was not rot and not flour, and the ground was soft as a chest after tears. Men had not trod here often, not in armies, not with iron nailed to their feet. The green man's steps made no sound at all. Howland's made the faintest whisper. On either side of the path the white trunks lifted in columns, faces scored in high relief, some old and cracked and flaking, some new carved, the mouth lines still raw and pink. He had the sense of walking between two ranks of men who would not bow for king or commons, and who were one thing and not 1,000, and who watched. The men gathered in the smallest clearing he had ever seen. It was no larger than a crofter's yard. Moss made a cushion of the earth in the center, and a spring bubbled up in a stone cup. Around it stood the weirwoods, 5 of them, faces turned inward, their roots threaded together underground, and around those trunks gathered the living. Howland recognized the cut of a blackwood cloak, raven feather trimmed dull and iridescent at once, and Jono's bracken scowl like a scar no man had stitched well. A man of Fry wore a pin shaped like that crossing crowned with petty tin. He smirked until his gaze touched the trees, then looked at his boots with great interest. The septon was younger than Howland expected, soft in the mouth and hands, hair thin as summer wheat, a star sewn into his gray robe thread by thread rather than wrought in metal. The eyes above the star were tired and kind. Beside him a squire in Tyrell green shifted from foot to foot and tried not to draw a sword he'd probably not used on anything harder than a pig. On the other side of the spring, a man in a worn maester's chain held a leather case and a little stick of slate. His chain was S. Hort, links of pewter and yellow brass, and he had the look of someone who would rather have been left alone with a tray of old scrolls and a window. The green man made no introductions. A shadow moved among shadows on the far side of the circle, where the trunks were whitest and the faces newest. No one saw the child step forward. One heartbeat there was moss and bark. The next there was a small thing with dark glossy skin dappled with paler flecks, hair tangled with leaves, eyes like golden lamplight through cat slits. She could have been the one in Howland's boat. The true tongue hummed through the clearing, and the hairs along every man's neck and arms stood. It was like wind in leaves and stones speaking as it settled its weight, like birds at dawn and rain tapping on 100 lake surfaces. It was not human speech, and yet it meant more to Howland than all the treaties Southron lords could write. "You have come," she said then in the common way. Bracken spat aside. "We've come to hear some new trick," he muttered. The blackwood glowered at him. "A trick is how you call a thing you can't understand when you are too proud to say you cannot," he said, and there was blood in every syllable of that feud. "Let them speak." "We are singing," the child said gently. "We have never stopped. You have forgotten the tune." The septon's fingers tightened on his book. "If you have called us here to blasphemy, we called you here in mercy," the child said, and there was no anger in it. She padded to the spring with a grace that had nothing of court or training yard and dipped her hand into the water. When the world was young, the old people and the new people warred. Blood ran into every stream. Trees fell. Men fell. We made a pact then, on this isle and on 100 others in places now plowed and paved and named and sold, and for a little time there was peace. Your iron came again. Our sap ran thin. There are always waves. The sea does not ask the fish or the moss whether they are weary. But some storms break stone and some storms break song. This storm is of the second kind. She looked up. Her cat's eyes were full of someone else's winter. The cold that remembers will come again in a shape that breathes and does not breathe. You have words for it, and we have words for it, and neither are whole. The long night is not one night. It is a hunger that learns. We can let it eat, or we can teach it a different song. Bracken snorted. The fry heir smirked anew, but cruder now. The maester in gray kept his chalk poised above his slate, as if afraid of what the stick might write if it moved on its own. The septon lowered his eyes, as if he could pray away the sense. Howland listened. He thought he could hear men's footfalls on frozen stones 100 leagues north, could smell iron and rot married by cold. "What song?" the Blackwood asked softly. "Truce," the child said. "A new pact, not like the last." The last was cut into the shape of two peoples who thought they knew what war was. You have war now in more shapes than your fathers could count. Your gods are not the only ones you have abandoned. The song must be made again to fit the throat you carry. Leave us the groves where the roots are old and deep. Give them back where you have not forgotten their names. Gather the weirwoods who have no faces into places where they can listen to one another. Do not burn what listens. Put down iron as easily as you can when you come to a face and speak your quarrels there. And let the faces hold your words and remember them until you can return. If you will guard our groves, we will open our hoards of black glass. We will call stone to run like water for it again. We will teach men with good hearts to listen the way roots do. We will show the marshes and the high ground where the dead do not love to walk. We will remember for you until your sons are brave enough to remember themselves. How large these groves! The fry voice when it came was sharp with ledger and list. There is land to be taxed. There are fields and game rights. What you ask has cost. What you lose has cost, the child said, with no malice. What you keep until there is nothing to keep has the greatest cost. You will not pay it when there is no one to pay. The fry boy opened his mouth again. Jonas Bracken put a hand on his shoulder, of all unlikely mercies, and squeezed hard enough that the boy winced and shut it. "What of the faith?" the septon asked. "Will you demand that men forsake the seven?" "We do not ask for your prayers," the child said. "We ask for your silence, where prayer can be louder than listening. Call your God to your groves if he can come with humility. We will not bar him. We only ask that iron and fire and pride stay at the water's edge." The maester took a breath. His chain rattled softly. At the citadel, the Isle of Faces is in our ledgers as somewhat legendary. There are no recent records. Many of us have believed the green men to be a tale, though there are some anomalies in the growth rings of certain samples of a number of trees. If the singers ask us to instruct the lords in such matters as tree schooling and, the location of older stands. "You are small for the place you keep," the child said. "You make more certainty than bread. We ask you to count as if it mattered which thing lived, and not only how many. If your counting can do that, we will count with you." The maester swallowed. "What you ask will be contested. What we ask will be alive," she said, and turned her small cat's gaze on Howland. "Pathmaker." He felt all their eyes on him, and those of the weirwoods besides. There was nothing to do then but what he had been sent to do. He stepped to the edge of the spring and knelt, the way he had knelt before faces in his own gods, would since he was little, and put his hand into the water. It was cold enough to make his teeth ache, and sweet, and he had the St. Range fanciful thought that it was not water at all but a story they were all telling in their different tongues, and it went down and down into the roots of the isle and came up again with another ending that was also a beginning. "The neck will swear what it can keep," he said to the small singer and the great faces around her. "We will set our groves and keep them, and we will show strangers where to walk when the dead are hunting. We will not cut where the song is loud. We will listen. We will stand in the doorways with black glass in our hands when the cold knocks. We will stand." The Blackwood placed his palm beside Howland's in the spring. His hand was bigger, the knuckles scarred, the nails black with bedded dirt. "The raven tree has fed a long time on a promise," he said in his deep river voice. "We have been a poor ally to promises. We will be better. We will keep your groves. The bracken." He looked over his shoulder, and his smile showed teeth. "If he will set down his pig for an hour, he may remember we have a common winter. Jono's Bracken snorted again, but after a thudding heartbeat he strode forward and slapped his palm into the spring with such force that water jumped and spattered his breastplate. By my father's grave and my mother's stones and the old gods I never claimed but never mocked, I will keep men's axes out of the standing faces. He growled, and his eyes were hot for fighting. I won't kneel to trees, mind you. They are older than kneeling, the child said mildly. Your bones will kneel for you when you are finished with them. The Septon hesitated so long that Howland thought the poor man would turn and flee the aisle. Then the star on his gray, painted robe shivered with a breath, and he came to his knees on the moss and touched the water with 2 fingers, as if it were oil to consecrate and make pure. The 7 know mercy, he whispered, and something in him was weeping at the same time. If mercy is to stand in groves, I will carry it to the men who do not find their way there. I will speak to the High Sparrow on this. He is a man who has walked barefoot in the dust and knows how to hear. He looked up into the nearest carved face, where the carver's hand had left one eye a little deeper than the other, and his mouth corked like a boy's. Forgive me if I stumble. The maester closed his eyes as if he had to make darkness to make a choice. Then he opened them and dewed the tip of his finger and pressed it to his brow, as if a book had written him rather than the other way. I have always been told that there were no green men and no singers, and that these faces were superstition. I am looking at the reasons to amend an index. He swallowed. I will return to Old Town and say what I have seen. I will say it plainly. If I am called a fool, I will be a fool. I think I have been worse for some time now. A wind moved among the red leaves and the white faces, and from the trunks came a sound that was not the true tongue and not the common one. And yet all the men there heard it as if mothers were singing to them when they had no words yet, and they had the urge to sleep and to weep and to stand. The truce was not made in that hour. The truce needed men who had not come, women who had not been asked, kings who would not be told by fens or faces or fog to be wiser than their greed. The truce would need food and boats and messengers and small oaths and 1,000 acts of discipline that could not be witnessed by anyone who would write a song about them, and 100 little mercies done at dusk when no one was counting. The truce would need to walk. The isle had started it. From the north came a wind of another kind before the 3rd hour had passed. It smelt of iron left too long in a well, and of old winter, and it moved against the leaves as if foe and lover both. Men looked up and flinched. The frye air went very still and very white. The green man turned his deer's crown and lifted his chin. They remember we are here, he said. We, Bracken said, and his hand found his sword hilt. We, the green man said and gestured, from beneath the roots, from the shadows under trunks, from against the very whiteness of the carved faces. Other small shapes moved and became not bark and not leaf but children. 6 of them, 8, 10, each with a long strange blade in one hand that gleamed like piece of night with stars caught in it. Obsidian, dragon glass. They watch us as we watch them, the green man said softly. This island has always been seen. The lake did not freeze. It became a mirror so quickly that the ripples from wind and oars had no time to remember what they were. And in that perfect stillness a raft drifted, as if pushed by hands too light to make a sound. On it stood forms with eyes like chips of sky and hair like frost, garbed in rhyme, pale as old water in deep wells. Men called them others. The singers had other names that meant winter that thinks and ice that watches the fire and remembers laying a hand upon it and being burned, and then waiting and now laying the hand again. The Septon made a strangled noise and then swallowed it as if his own throat were a bell he dared not ring. The fry boy hissed. Bracken's sword rasped an inch and caught. The Blackwood lifted his hand and made a fist. Men in dark cloaks moved from the edges of the clearing, bows in hand, broadheads of black glass already knocked. The green man did not move at all. The raft came sliding along the mirror to the pebble beach like a thought finishing itself. There were 4 of them upon it, tall and willowy, their armors full of impossible light. They did not step onto the shore. Their eyes were cold that made Howland's bones whine. One lifted a long pale blade, airy as a sigh. The nearest weirwood made a sound like teeth striking, wood on wood. The singer child beside the spring set her bare toes more firmly into moss and looked at the 4. with no more fear than she had shown men. "You come where we remember," she said in her leaf murmur, but there was iron under it, older than iron. The other tilted its narrow head. It spoke, and it was the shiver of icicles falling and making music like small bells at dawn, and every man present felt his breath go thin. Howland had to force his lungs to work. The words were no men's words he had heard, and all the same he knew what they were. They were the name of winter as a debt, of owing and collecting in a ledger kept very clean. The child answered in the true tongue. The two sounds met in the air and moved through each other and became a long quiet, as if stones had listened to water for too long and had learned how to speak back. She spoke again, and the other raised the pale blade and let it fall, not in strike, down into the raft before its feet, where ice met would soundlessly. When the blade came back up, a long, narrow chip of its edge remained in that mirror. The raft turned itself and slid away as if called by some old habit of tide. The wind that had come with them went with them. Howland let out a breath he had not realized he had stowed away. "What did it?" he began, and had to begin again. "What did it say?" The child touched the spring's surface until it stilled from its small gleamings and showed moss and faces as if the eye of the lake were contained in the pool and the pool in the lake. "It said they remember the first deals better than we do," she said. "It said any truce we sing must be sung in more than one throat. It said they are hungry." The fry boy found his voice first. "What are your groves against that?" he demanded, shaking. "What are trees? For the warrior's sake. We need swords. We need walls. We need doors that open slowly," the green man said, and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. There was kindness in that hand and a weight. "We will give you glass for your arrows and for your knives, and water for your walls. We will call the roots up where the dead dislike to walk. And you must do the smaller brave things that cannot be sung about, and you must put down iron when you stand before a face and let the face keep your quarrel. This will be harder for you than arrows." Time after that was measured as much by what did not happen as by what did. No armies marched, no crowns clashed. Men did not flock in thousands to the island with swords in their fists to burn and take. They came in tens, a dozen here, a score there. A knight whose lady had lost 2 babes to still cold winters crept into the grove at Maester's mill and left his sword on the ground and took up a spade and made a fence around the white tree with his own hands. 2 brothers from Stonehenge crept in the dark to carve a face into a weirwood grown up unnoticed behind their pig pens and kept their brawling for the sacred place until they could remember the first cause and let the rest drop. A daughter from the twins rowed across in a skiff at midnight and kissed the foot of a carved face and begged silently to be allowed to leave her name behind, and did not think it strange when the wind answered her in a way that took the last of the cold from her bones. Howland set to his work. He and his cousins drifted down the Green Fork and the Red, up through the first river and down again into lesser streams that remembered the ice of 1,000 winters and the mud of 10,000 springs. They found the old groves where a man's hair shifted with the sound of a sapling's dream, and they marked them with little tricks that marsh folk knew. Bundles of withies hung high where no flood could take them, pebbles arranged in spirals that made the unwary step aside without wanting to, a dead eel wrapped around a branch at a bend in the water. They showed the green men the paths through the reeds where a dead man's feet would not naturally go. They gave black glass to river lords who took it with grave faces and sent it to smiths, who tried it on the edge of leather and flinched at how it cut, sending it back with their own small prayers. He sent word to White Harbor and to Winterfell, whether Bolton or Bandit claimed it, and made of that old name a weight with which to weigh deeds. He wrote to a woman in the Vale who had once answered to Elaine and to Sansa both, and told her there were places where her smallest kindness would be as mighty as a host. From Old Town, a single boat came without banners, after dark. 2 men were in it, and a woman with a child at her breast. One of the men wore a chain, but he kept it tucked beneath his plain collar. The other had the look of a man who had run from something he had needed very much and could not admit wanting. He paused at the pebbled shore and looked across the flat water and let out a sound that was too close to a laugh to be only a cry. "Samwell," the chainless maester said softly. "I thought I'd forgotten the name of wonder," Sam said. He had the shoulders of a man used to carrying news that hurt and could not be ignored. He also had hands good for holding a babe, which he did while the woman, Gilly stepped ashore and saw the weirwoods all together and made a small sound as if someone had shown her how big the sky was, all at once. They met Howland by the spring. Sam knelt almost before he realized he had knelt and put his hand into the water. He looked up, meek and open, and the child who had called Howland in the marsh looked upon him with a softness that had no pity in it. "You killed one of their elders," she said, not pleased, not accusing. "You cried while you did it." Sam nodded helplessly and let out a breath that had lived in him a long time. "I do not think I will ever stop crying," he said, and Gilly kissed his ear and made a practical little soothing sound like a dove on a rail. "You will," the child said, "not because it will hurt less, because you will have taught the hurting to make a different sound." Sam brought news. He brought a parchment written in his careful hand and signed with a somewhat reluctant firmness by a man named Ambrose whose chain was longer than Sam's, and a seal from a door in the citadel that had not been opened for many winters. He brought a list of groves marked in old maps and cross-referenced 3 times. He brought sachets of powdered glass and notes in the margins about the best way to flake an obsidian core into knives and arrowheads without cutting one's fingers to ribbons. He brought tales from the far north, piled up at the wall like snow against a door, of eyes in the woods and the return of small dead things to men's doorways as if knocking. He brought something harder to carry than any of it, a quiet certainty that he had been wrong for a long time, and that being right was not as clean as men wanted it to be. Howland listened to him in the patient way the marsh listened to weather. "What do you need?" he asked when the telling had moved from fear to work and back again. "People who will not need to be right," Sam said, and he laughed without laughing. "And boats, and more boats, and to do a simple thing 1,000 times and not become a different worse person while we do it." On the lake, the mirror watched, and clouds moved through it like old kings. The others did not return to the pebbled shore. They moved along the far deeps, where men had always thrown certain offerings and where eels grew long. In villages along the Red Fork, pigs began to refuse certain wallows. In a mill town upriver, a girl with hair like flax began to hear whispers in the wind. She sat down beneath a new carved face and told it the truth about the boy she loved and the child she carried, and the wind came later to her window like a hand and blew her shutters closed when snow came early. In the castle of Raventree, children learned a new game with rules that could be changed only when all the players went into the godswood and the rules were spoken beneath the face, where words had weight and made a sound in the roots. Boys who would have broken noses at Stonehenge mended fences instead, then went there to argue them properly. Not everyone was pleased. In the Twins, a second son of some lesser line made a show of felling a weirwood sapling with his new-bought axe, and was found in the morning with the axe haft warped into a serpent around his wrist and finger-deep grooves in his palm where he had been unable to let it go. In King's Landing, a clever courtier with a mind like a well-oiled hinge counted groves and tried to put his hand on the profits of groves and found his sums always one short, one long, one miswritten, as if someone behind his shoulder added and subtracted while humming and would not let him finish. South of Harrenhal, a company of Sellswords burned a small copse of new-faced saplings because a captain had no patience for songs. Half the men woke the next morning to find their mouths full of leaves and could not spit them out for 3 days. The songs went on. Howland took to moving nightly. The marsh had taught him to sleep in places other men would not think of and to move at hours other men would have called mad. Now he moved by row and by pole and by elk path along the green margins, carrying with him a satchel of black glass that cut hide and ice alike, and a list of names and memories heavier than both. He woke once with the certainty that he had, like a boy, fallen asleep beneath the roots of a tree, and looked up to see a face he had known when his beard was black looking down at him with eyes as bright as a hawk's. "Ned," he said, and his throat closed. The face was only a face. He bowed his head beneath it anyway. "It should have been me," he whispered, "for old wounds do not close so much as alter the way a man stands." And the wind touched his hair like a brother's hand and then was a wind again. At Raventree they held the first of the small moots. It was not a king's thing, no crowns, no banners, no lists of the order in which men should speak. It was a fence-mending set in a larger ring than a fence. Tyto's Blackwood stood with his back to his ancient tree and his front to his ancient foe. Jono's bracken stood opposite him. Between them, The little singer who had called Howland stood with her bare toes in the dark loam and her dagger of black glass in her hand, like the idea of sharpness more than its form. "The bracken claims the ford," the Blackwood said, tired and not trying to sound like a lord, only like a man. "We claim the fishery. The ford implies approach to the fishery, and so we do not like to see their men on that bank. They do not like to see ours. It has been this way since my 10 greats-grandfather. The ford has always been ours," Bracken said roughly, but some of the ancient heat was gone. He had stood in the aisle's center and put his hand into the spring. He could feel it still, like a third thing beneath flesh and bone, like a thought one cannot rid himself of. "If the Blackwoods wanted fish, they should have been born our color. We took the ford when—" "No taking," the child said very gently, and pointed her knife not at men but at the damp air. "Give, share, leave, listen, try the words and see which one makes the root under your feet loosen." The men looked down, as if afraid to see a literal root under their boots, and laughed. Then they did not laugh. The Blackwood rubbed his scarred knuckles. "We will leave the north bank undefended for 3 days each fortnight," he said, surprising himself. "The bracken can water his horses and pass to the ford. We will set boys together to count fish and share them. If the bracken send a man with an axe into our wood to take a sapling there, we will drag him to the face and say what we think of it, and he can say his piece, and we will see what the face remembers about our fathers." Jono's Bracken grunted. The idea of boys together, Bracken and Blackwood, did something to his bark, took one flake off it. "If your boys try to take ours into the wood for other purposes, we'll hang them with willow twine and then come tell your face about it," he said. "The ford stays ours. Your men don't water there on the days that aren't yours." The child inclined her head a little, and the true tongue trembled around their ankles like a very quiet river. The roots underfoot settled. Small moots made small peace. The peace spread by being easy to speak and easier to keep than the old habits of harm. Where men wished to break it, the faces made them say so plainly enough to shame themselves. In every third village, one hand found it easier to set down iron now than it had the week before. In every 10th, a hand picked iron up that should have stayed down, and a boy or a girl or a woman old enough to be grandmother bravely took it away. The cold watched. It sent messengers, not men, not crows, not even wolves, but drift and sound, and a quiet of the wrong kind. In fields along the tumblestone, men woke to find frost along the furrows like writing. In letters no man had made and all men could read, the frost named hunger. Men answered with wood and song. Sam took boats back and forth between the isle and the river towns until he knew the shape of every reed bed and the temper of every sandbar. He acquired 4 long shallow craft with flat bottoms and heavy oars. He taught boys how to flake glass without losing their thumbs and how to lash it to ash shafts. He cried when he was alone in the stern and laughed at himself and wiped his eyes and rowed. He slept with his head against a coil of hemp and dreamed of a door in the north that only a song could close, and woke with the taste of salt in his mouth, and knew it was not from the lake. In the end, the hunger did not send another raft. It rolled itself upon the world in the way the world had known before and learned anew each time a man was foolish enough to think he had seen the last of it. A wind came out of no quarter on a night when the moon made of the lake a tarnished plate. Men slept as men do when peace has made them brave in a different way than war does. The wind moved across the eye in a white shiver. On the shingle of the shore, one by one, candles guttered. In the groves, one by one, red leaves quivered and went still. Above Herrenhol's ruins, a bird with long night wings banked once, twice, and then fell out of the air like a stone. On the far deep, lights began to move beneath the surface. They were dull and blue and terrible. They came toward the island in straight lines. The green men were ready. Howland was not sure how. It was not as if they had drilled. There had been no shouts, no ranks, no lines. But when the dull lights neared, men stood where they needed to stand, and boys did what they had practiced by habit rather than command. Rivers ran into the lake, and where they ran, the reeds stood thick, and where reeds stood, the dead disliked to move. The green men had worked for months without a sound to pull old mats of reed root into new places, to weave them into living nets I could see from a boat. They had taken willow and ash and woven them into palisades that looked like other willows and ashes. Beneath the waterlines of 20 small skiffs, Sam had made of tar and something the singers had given him, a caulking that would not take frost. They did not think to win anything that night, only to keep the place where the faces watched. The others came without rafts or steps. They came walking along the lake bottom as if walking among stars on a far night sky. The dull blue lights that moved below were their eyes, and their armor gleamed like thought. Whites came before them, floating often rather than stepping, in a silence that made men's throats hurt, as if they had to swallow to make a sound around it. The first flights of arrows were glass-tipped. They struck water and kept traveling because the lake had become more gelid than water should be, as if it were thinking about ice as a man thinks about war. The dragon glass bit and held. Whites jerked. Men who had never before drawn against anything more terrible than a stag doubled their grip and drew again. Bracken and Blackwood stood shoulder to shoulder at the reed palisade near the narrow cove. They had bickered all afternoon in smallness over whose men would hold which breathing place and who would feed the boys who stood the night shift. Now they stood like brothers, and if one of them grinned when the other had to fire left-handed because his right hand had stiffened in cold, well, there were worse brothers. The Septon stood with his hand against a face long enough for the bark to imprint itself upon his palm. He prayed, not for victory, not for anything as big as that. He prayed for the candles to stay lit in cottages where men were remembering how to be gentle. He prayed for a rope not to break. He prayed that if his soul were to be weighed, that the scale would be kind and exact in equal measure. Then he picked up a bucket and ran where a boy shouted for more oil and did not feel foolish for ministering with his whole body. Samrod. His breath sounded like a different man's in his own chest, and then like several men's. He could not hold the oar and the babe at the same time. So Gilly took the babe at the last and kissed his cheek and said in a voice steady as a winter branch, "Go on, Sam." And he did, because when Gilly told him to do something that mattered, he had learned by now that she was usually right. Howland stood in the shallows where he could use his frog spear like the thing it was born to be. He had thought he might feel fear as he had felt at the tower, that fear that had a shape and a name and a purpose. This was different. It felt like going under and having to remember the way back up. He breathed in and out and sang under his breath in the true tongue as best he could, which in a man's mouth was always only a hum with certain notes held for sare. Tane lengths of heart. He thought he could feel through the butt of his spear the way the roots under the lake spoke to one another. He drove the glass head into a thing that had been a man and then a not man and now was a kind of memory wrapped around ice, and it came apart with a soft torn sound like old linen. He turned and thrust and turned again. The others reached the reed palisade. Two of them came forward with their light armor and their long pale blades and set their hands to the living willow. The bark froze dark where they touched it. Frost crept along the living weave. The willow shivered. It would have broken then, as wood will under a new weight it has not learned how to carry, except that the green men were standing inside it, their antlers passing through it somehow as if the weave were part of them, and they sang without moving their mouths. The willow remembered spring when it was just water and light thinking. It embraced that thought, and the frost that had crept along it cracked and fell away in little sighing sheets. The longest of the others lifted a hand then. The cold in the air thickened until the wind could not move through it, and men's breath fell like small stones. The other reached, slow as a tree grows, and laid one long white finger to the palisade. The willow went still. A silence descended that was not the absence of sound but the presence of something else, and Howland knew that if it were allowed to continue it would stop not the willow alone but the agreement that had made the willow, and the hands that had woven it would forget why hands were for anything but fists. The singer child appeared in the willow, as if she had always been there. She did not have to push past anyone or lift branches. She only stepped in, and the space made itself for her. She lifted her black glass blade. It looked very small against a pale sword that had never learned to be anything but sharp. She reached and pressed the dagger's point to the other's fingertip. There was no clash, no flare. There was a little sound like a bubble breaking, like a babe's first breath. Frost leapt backward as if stung. The other drew its hand away. It looked down at the smallest wound it would ever take and then up at the singer. It made a sound like a low-far bell. It withdrew. It did not flee. It took its weight away and took with it a pressure neither men nor wood had loved. After, there was fighting. There was always fighting in the small, even when the great had come and gone. Whites caught in reed nets thrashed and were cut. Men lunged and pulled and dragged. Gilly's boy screamed once and then slept because some mercy still held in the world. Sam's hands bled because obsidian had a spite for men's fingers even when it had no spite for men's courage. The septon knelt in mud to close a boy's wound with clean cloth instead of a prayer, and did not know he had done something more pleasing to gods than any song he had sung in a long time. Bracken and Blackwood swore at one another and then laughed at one another's swearing and then thumped their shoulders together because all their words had run out and they were still alive. When the dull lights beneath the lake fell away at last and the mirror surface ruffled and broke as it should under wind and oars, the green men stood among the willows and let their antlers tilt toward earth. The singer child came out from the living weave and stood at the edge of the spring. She looked very small then and very young. Howland felt, for a breath, as if it were his own daughter he had lost and found. Sam came and stood beside him, hands cut and wrapped and shaking. He did not cry. He wanted to. He would later, and the crying would be a kind of clean. For now he looked at the child and at the lake and at the pale faces that kept watching and said only, "It will come again. It always comes again," the child said. "So do we. What do we do when we are tired?" Sam asked, and it was not entirely a joke. The child put her hand in the spring and then let the water run off her fingers back into the pool. "We sit in a grove and we put down iron and we listen until our breathing becomes the breathing of something larger than our own chest," she said. "In the listening we will hear where the next door is. We will go there. We will do this a long time. In the long time, the song will eat hunger until hunger becomes a different thing." Howland slept at last under a face and woke with preserved leaves in his hair, the kind that held summer's veining through deep winter. He ate smoked eel and flatbread and went to speak to Bracken and Blackwood together because the habit of doing things together was beginning to grow between them, like moss on a fallen tree. He sent 2 cousins upriver with a satchel of glass and a list of small things to do that would appear to no one like heroism. Fetch water, sit with old men, take oil to a wheel, mend a fence. He sent a letter, sealed in green wax with a rush pressed into it, to a girl in the Vale who had learned to be 2 names and then had learned that the most important name was the one she would make for herself, and asked her to protect groves in high places where wind cut at stone. He sent word to White Harbor, where a fat lord laughed like a bellows and then lifted a boy over his head and told him it was all right to be both kind and terrifying. He sent word to the Dreadfort, careful and silent as a man crossing a frozen pond, and received no answer, but sometimes no answer was a kind of answer a man could use to measure his steps. That winter was not the end of anything. The hunger that had learned the shape of men took its learning elsewhere, along the Green Fork and through the Wolfswood and north again where doors stood and would need hands to close them every night for a long time. The truce was not some sudden clean new law that made all knives melt and all men wise. The truce became something about how men held their knives and when they put them down. It became a series of habits that, once formed, were as hard to break as the old ones had been, which was the best victory a small brave thing can hope to win against a large evil one. On the last day of that first season of the new pact, the singers sang where men could hear. They had sung always, where stone and root had ears, but this time they stood where light fell, and Howland and Sam and the Septon and Bracken and Blackwood and 20 boys and girls and a man who wore antlers like a crown and no pride like one stood and listened. The true tongue poured as clearly as the spring, and the weirwood's faces shone with the moisture the world calls tears when it does not know what else to name it. No man understood the words, and all men knew what was said. It was a long song, and it was simple. It said, "We will remember for you when you cannot." It said, "Put down iron at the thresholds, because thresholds are places where the world must decide what it is." It said, "The dead do not love reed mats, nor willow fences, nor children's games with rules spoken beneath a face. Make many of these things and keep making them, and the dead will come less easily." It said, "When the cold comes to your door, open slowly, with black glass in your hand and kindness in your other." Said, Songs like Winter's Return said, "So do you." When it ended, there was no cheer. Men do not cheer at the end of a thing they know will begin again tomorrow. They breathed with the trees and went about making the small brave things that would be needed. The island stood in the center of the lake like an eye, and in its pupil men had, for a short honest time, learned to look back and see themselves. In Harrenhal's black towers some ghost of heat lingered, and at dusk smoke rose that no hand had kindled. Perhaps some lord long dead had walked through a god's wood once and remembered briefly how to put down iron. Stories crossed the lake and went upriver and then down again and nested in thatches and behind shutters and in the soft places of men's hearts where they kept their private bravery. The marsh breathed fog. The reeds sang gossip. The world, stubborn and wounded, tried again to be kind. Spring, when it came, did not come sweet. That was never how real spring came in places worth loving. It came with rot and smell and too much water and too much that needed mending. It came with calves born in mud and washed by hands and lambs standing on noble knees where before there had been only hunger talking to itself around men's fires. It came to groves where the new carved faces were beginning to crack a little around the eyes, and men came with small knives and oiled them with fat and pressed cloths to them to keep them from splitting further. It came to temples where a septon would say at the end of a prayer that the seven had many names, and that when a man went into a grove to listen he should take his shoes off and leave his iron with his neighbor. And when men protested he would smile in the particular way of a man who had learned something harder than arguing and let them tire themselves with words. The song did not end. It altered. It offered new verses when needed. It made of a world that had thought itself finished with wonder a place where wonder could still find doorways, if doors were opened slowly. When men asked later, in years when it seemed the hunger had gone elsewhere and perhaps would never return, what had been the miracle, the old ones said, there was no miracle. There was a child who called a crannogman in the fog, and a man who rowed a boat without crying until he was done rowing, and a priest who learned to hold water, and a pair of old enemies who put down iron when they stood beneath a face. There was a winter that wanted to teach men to be hungry, and a song that wanted to teach them to be difficult. The song was more stubborn. Years from that first call, when Howland's hair had thinned and gone as pale as the frost he had outwaited, he pulled out into his own marsh at dawn, because dawn in the marsh strongest resembled truth. The fog rose with the tide. It crept along the hummocks and pooled in the reeds like breath and then rose. A heron with eyes like a red-stained spear waited on the prow. Howland slid his boat silently between old stumps half submerged in brown water. He did not wait long. When the fog parted, a small thing stood upon the planks of his boat as if she had been there all along. "You listen," she said. It was not a question. "As well as a man can," he said. "Better," she said, and then she smiled, full of too many teeth, and he found that beautiful and not fearsome at all. "We will ask again," she said, as if asking were as natural a thing as singing. The sea does not beg the shore to be shore. Comes, puts its hand upon it. The shore remains shore because it remembers how. We will remind you. You will remind us. That is all a pact is, done properly. He nodded. He knew now how much of everything rested upon whether a man returned from a long day and remembered to put his knife away in the place where it belonged. How much of winter depended upon whether two boys who had fathers who could not forget a feud would fish together as if there was no feud to inherit. He had learned it late. That was all right so long as it was not too late to keep learning. "Truce," he said, and set his pole again to the brown channel's bed and pushed. The boat moved. The fog, obliging as ever, made way. The marsh gossiped. Somewhere in the deep of the world the roots took the small message and carried it to one another, and to the faces, and to the places beyond faces where even the true tongue does not go. The song kept itself. The truce held in the way good things hold, in the small and in the stubborn, and in the many hands that keep making it true.